Hi, everyone. I'm Hannah Francis in Madison, Wisconsin. I'm a first-year PhD student in the Department of Soil and Environmental Science at UW-Madison, and I study nutrient cycling with cover crops with Dr. Matt Ruark. And let me introduce Dr. Matt Ruark, your regional expert in cover crops and nutrient cycling. Matt will speak on how dairy production in Wisconsin creates opportunities and challenges when it comes to soil and water conservation. This presentation will explore both of these issues and aspects and highlight farmer collaborations to address some of these important issues. So Dr. Matt Ruark is a professor in the Department of Soil and Environmental Sciences and a state specialist in the UW Division of Extension. His research and extension programs focus on nitrogen cycling in Wisconsin with the goal of improving nitrogen use efficiency in grain, dairy, and potato systems. Please welcome Dr. Matt Ruark.
Thanks, Anna, for a wonderful introduction. So today I am going to talk about conservation versus production in the dairy state. And to start with, just to kind of remind ourselves why we're the dairy state, here's a great map that was put out by Horde's Dairymen that does highlight the amount of cows or the cow density per square mile on a county basis. And you can see what makes Wisconsin special when we look at a map like this is that we really have a lot of dairy production across the state. So we don't just have isolated pockets of dairy production. Dairy production exists throughout the state of Wisconsin. When we also talk about being the dairy state, we think about milk, but we really need to think about cheese. So if we think about our total cheese production, if Wisconsin were a country, we would rank fourth in the world in cheese production. So slightly less than Germany and France, but Wisconsin produces more cheese than Italy. So we have a lot of cows. They're producing a lot of milk. We're making a lot of cheese. But I'm not an animal scientist. I'm not a dairy scientist. I work on the parts of the dairy system that come out of the back end of the cow and then producing things that go into the front end of the cow. So I'm interested, or I do work in the area of manure management and crop production. So the cows produce a lot of manure. We land apply that manure. We use that manure to fertilize crops. We grow the crops to feed the animal. Two of the main crops that we grow for feed production are alfalfa and corn grown for silage. And these are crops that have two different avenues when it comes to conservation. Alfalfa is a perennial crop. So when we harvest it, it'll grow for several years. When we harvest it, we always have, there's always existing plants being grown. So it's a wonderful crop. The soil is always covered. There's always something growing on that field. In contrast to corn silage. So this is a picture of a field that has had a recent corn silage harvest. With corn silage harvest, it's a complete removal of that entire plant. So the entire corn plant is harvested. It's ensiled and fed to cows over time. So this creates an issue, right? We have all of this exposed soil. After corn silage fields are harvested, they're exposed to erosion risks, right? So what do we want to do? We want to think about soil conservation. What can we do to reduce erosion losses? Also at the time of corn silage harvest, a lot of these fields will have a manure application. So what's going on here? So we have all of that manure that's being produced by the cows. This is the chance to get some manure applied. Why are they applying in the fall? Well, dairy farms generally may only have manure storage capacity up to 90 days of storage. So they need to get that manure land applied. They can only store it for so long, right? Corn silage being harvested provides an opportunity for the land application. What's the issue here? So the issue is that the manure, while it may contribute, right, we're going to use it we can think about it as a fertilizer source. It can contribute to the nitrogen needs of the next crop, but applying the nutrients now, 7, 8 months prior to even the planting of that next crop, can lead to or can pose some risks to groundwater quality. Putting out nitrogen that far in advance means there's more opportunity for that nitrogen to leach into groundwater. So what are the solutions? So the solutions, or the most popular solution that a lot of farmers are looking to is the use of cover crops. So here, cover crops are a solution to both the erosion and the water quality challenges posed in this cropping system. So cover crops are crops grown but not harvested. So in this case, we're interested in planting a crop to literally cover the soil. So in a picture like this is a picture taken in the spring. On the left is a winter rye cover crop that was planted after corn silage harvest and after manure application the previous fall. So you can see we have, on the left with that winter rye, it's a nice stand. It really blankets, carpets the soil. So there's a lot of erosion protection, as well as the idea that it also took up a lot of nutrients. It trapped a lot of nutrients from that manure that was applied in the fall. So a lot of the nutrients that would have leached out over the winter months and the spring months have now been captured and trapped in the above ground biomass of these plants. And so you can see it's a great crop in terms, or it's a great practice to pose, right? So versus on the right, where it still has all this exposed soil, you can even see maybe some parts of where there was a little erosion happening. So it's a great conservation management practice that a lot of farmers are looking towards. So another way to look at it like this, so just to kind of put it in sort of a cropping sequence. So we can start with, September, we're growing corn, we're harvesting it for silage. The next step is we're going to apply manure after silage is harvested. Planting that cover crop, right? We get that cover crop planted, we get some growth in the fall, get some soil coverage, get some nutrients being trapped. Winter rye, a cover crop like winter rye, will survive the winter. And so the snow melts, we have a nice cover crop existing. It grows a little bit more into the spring months, again, providing additional soil coverage, trapping additional nutrients. We go out and we have to chemically terminate it to kill it. So we do have to kill it. We do have to manage it. And then we're going to plant the next crop. So having the cover crop during these months, that's the opportunity for water quality improvement, right? But what's the trade-off, right? And that's the question. Are there trade-offs with production? We're doing something new to the system with this cover crop here. Does growing this cover crop affect that next crop in any way? And the issue here is that for conservation management practices to be implemented and really adopted, right, we need to demonstrate it's not going to hurt the bottom line of the farmer. We can't, for these sort of things to be used, farmers want proof that it's not going to affect their production and their economic return. So let's talk about that. So we've done a lot of work. A lot of this work is funded by the USDA. This work is also funded by the Wisconsin Fertilizer Research Council, with the idea of okay, if we're going to implement this conservation practice of a cover crop, what's going to happen? One, are we actually getting conservation benefits? And two, is it influencing the production of the next year's crop? So again, this is a picture from a research trial that we did with winter rye, which survives the winter. Across all of our studies, which were conducted at our Wisconsin Agricultural Experiment Station, as well as farm fields throughout Wisconsin, we see a range of anywhere between 800 to up to 3,000 pounds of biomass per acre. So in a picture like this is probably getting close to, this is probably more in the 1,500 range. Across that, we're interested in how much biomass, how much mass of the cover crop it's grown. We want to know how much nitrogen it takes up. So across this range, we generally see between 25 to 90 pounds of nitrogen taken up in that above ground biomass. So in contrast, so for comparative purposes, corn, we would recommend anywhere between maybe 140 to 180 pounds of nitrogen applied to a corn crop. So this is a good amount. This represents a lot of nitrogen taken up out of our soil system. So excellent for water quality, right? A lot less nitrogen that it had the potential to leach out. But what's the effect on that next crop? So the main issue here is that we are applying manure with the idea that it's going to, that nitrogen in the manure is going to fertilize that next season's crop. The cover crop in a perfect world, would only take up the amount of nitrogen that was going to leach out. But in reality, it does a little more than that. It actually taps into the amount that might be that we were maybe planning on being available for that corn crop. So the main finding of this research then is that when the amount of nitrogen in that above ground, in that cover crop biomass exceeds 50 pounds, then the farmers need to apply an extra 50 pounds as fertilizer to maximize productivity. So the cover crops, in a way, they trap nitrogen. They do a great job of that. But they also trap nitrogen that we were going to expect to be available to that next corn crop. So what farmers need to do is they just simply need to supplement a little bit more nitrogen to maximize productivity. So that comes with a cost, though, right? So there's a little more nitrogen that needs to be applied. So we need to apply a little more nitrogen, but what about the overall yields? So the other thing that we found, and this is a figure from across all of our research studies, which does include some other grass cover crops, such as annual ryegrass or barley. And here I graphed the amount of cover crop biomass on the x-axis, and I compared that to the difference, the delta, or the difference in the maximum yield between corn that followed a cover crop versus corn that didn't follow a cover crop. So a negative number implies that there was a yield reduction following the cover crop. And so what we can see here is that there was a trend towards when we grew more biomass, when more biomass occurred, that's when the risk of greater yield losses also occurred. So across kind of these two metrics we're looking at, how much nitrogen do we need to apply? Is it going to cost more to grow the crop? And am I actually growing as much? Can I get as much yield? The risks associated with those things generally occur when we grew a lot of biomass. So in a picture like this that I showed early, this might be too much biomass, right? So how do we grow enough biomass to achieve our conservation goals, right? We want to grow enough where we have soil coverage, and we want to make sure we trap enough nitrogen and have a real reduction in nitrate leaching to groundwater. But how do we do this without hurting production? So the simplest thing we can do is how far back can we cut when we plant the cover crop? So in a lot of our research, we planted between a seeding rate of that winter rye of 60 to 90 pounds per acre. Here in this study, we actually cut it back even further to 30 pounds. So we compared 30, 60, 90, or 120 pound seeding rates. And so the more seeds we put out per acre ended up having more and more biomass so we were increasing the amount of cover crop biomass with an increasing seeding rate. Okay, so what do we get for that increasing seeding rate? One quick way we can visualize this is the percent green coverage when we look down onto the soil. So as we go from, for our normal seeding rates that we may recommend, maybe 60, maybe up to 90, we're getting 87, 90, with 120 pounds, we get 91% green area. So we get 90 up to 90% of that soil covered. When we cut back to 30%, there was a reduction, but not that much. We still had 75% soil coverage with a lower seeding rate. And that's great. So we're still achieving some goals with even a smaller amount of biomass produced. Now we can compare these. Let's compare these other effects, right? How much more do we need when we cut back on the seeding rate? Did we need more nitrogen? And did it hurt yields compared to no cover crop? So again, with no cover crop, again, this is with a manure application, we still needed 65 more pounds of nitrogen to achieve our yields, and we got about 200 bushels. So that's kind of our baseline. Compare that to when we used 30 pounds and we had that 75% coverage, we also needed 65 more pounds of nitrogen. So we needed exactly the same amount of nitrogen. So that cover crop did not tie up any nitrogen, and we didn't have to apply any extra nitrogen to the system when we used the cover crop. And we actually saw a very small uptick. We actually achieved 205 bushels. So it didn't hurt yields at all when we did that. Now, right, contrast to that 90 pounds where we get an extra 15% soil coverage, but we needed 90 pounds nitrogen, more nitrogen. So in total, so 25 more pounds nitrogen compared to without a cover crop. And there wasn't a big risk, but there was maybe a little risk of some yield loss in this situation. So it's very clear as we start to think about these agronomic effects and what's happening, we don't need to grow, world record cover crop growth to achieve our conservation goals. We can get away with a minimum, just getting some cover crops planted, getting a minimum amount of growth that's just going to cover the soil. That's all we need. And that's great because that means that we can get a lot more adoption with farmers, or if all they need to do is just to get something out there, get a little bit of growth. It'll be easy to manage in the spring, and then there's not going to be those negative effects on our cropping system. So in the end, I think yes, right? Yes, there can be trade-offs between conservation, soil conservation, and crop production. And we do need to acknowledge that, and we do need to study it and test it. But through better management, soil and nutrient conservation can be achieved in our dairy-based cropping systems in Wisconsin without sacrificing productivity. And this is work that we're going to continue on. We have a lot more trials with participating farmers and crop consultants and dairy farmers throughout the state to get more information out so farmers can feel more comfortable with adopting this practice. And with that, I thank everyone for their time, and on Wisconsin.